So I'm Hayan Charara, and I'm the author of Something Sinister, my third book of poems.
You're actually being recognized for 2 books this evening, Something Sinister, your poetry collection, but also The Three Lucys, a children's picture book. I wanted to start by asking about how the cats named Lucy really come up in both pieces, and in the poem Animals in your collection, and then also as characters in the picture book. And I was wondering if you could talk about really what inspired you to explore this concept and the July War in such different ways and for different audiences.
Sure. The name Lucy is tied to the dog that my wife and I rescued in New York City. It's a black lab that we found tied to a subway entrance, and she was pregnant. That part of the narrative is represented in the poem about the story. The poem is called Animals. And we rescued the animal, and my brother at the time, he's in high school now, but he was a 3-year-old. It was the first animal he had a real connection to. And when he finally had pets of his own, he actually named the first several of them Lucy. So he had several Lucys in the house, and so the idea for the name came from that, just a real story. And you know, there's a beautiful kind of childhood innocence in it, right? To name all of your pets after the first one that you grew attached to. I didn't think of writing the story for the children's book until long after I actually wrote about the July War in a poem, and it was one of the first poems I'd written after I'd spent about a year where I didn't write much. There's no glamorous story behind it. I simply had quit smoking and just had a hard time writing. But the July War took place in 2006, and I was 6 months into my trying to quit smoking. And when I finally sat down to work on the poem, it was several months later, and it was at the time just a time-consuming event, and it was obviously anxiety-producing. I had family that lived in Lebanon, and my little brother was actually living there as well, and by then he was 6 years old, and so it was a daily calling to find out if they were okay, and worrying about them, and I held on to. I mean, it's the definition of trauma, right? It's something that happens to you and stays with you and recurs in some other way. And whether it's in poetry or whether someone is dealing with trauma in a clinical way or a historic way, there's a need to go back to it and to make sense of it, to grapple with the questions, and that's essentially what I was doing in the poem, to go back to that event and try to make sense of, primarily in the poem, I was trying to make sense of the helplessness. The war was, relatively speaking, short, but it was devastating, and it was difficult to get politicians. At the time, the politicians I tried to the politicians I tried to reach out to have them do something about the war, to step in some way or another. My congressmen and senators in Texas, is where I was living, were not interested. And many people I would talk to were also, not that they were disinterested, but they were indifferent almost to what was happening. And I had to figure out a way to reach them, and the way was not through people. And this is sad to say, but we become easily desensitized or distanced from the suffering of many people. But rather, I went through the way of animals, what happened to the dogs and the cats in this war. And that really touched a nerve and grabbed people's attention. And it's a few years later that I was urged to, once again, by one of my mentors, who's Naomi Shibnai, the poet and children's author. She'd been trying to get me to write a children's story for years. She first reached out in the early 90s and just wasn't ready to do it. And yet again, she came back to me. I was actually in San Antonio where she lives. We were having lunch, and she told me about this book award in this press that is focused on writers of color, stories by and for people of color, and suggested I give them something. And the only story that I really knew about a young person that wasn't the only story I knew, but the one that kept coming to mind was the story of my brother's experience in war. And I thought it would be a challenging project to pick up because it's not your typical subject for children's literature, but I knew that if I could handle it in a certain way, it might work. And that's how I got to writing the story. And then it took a few years for the revisions and the illustrations to work, but I think it was in the end worthwhile.